I asked the preacher that day in Sunday school, will I see Butch in heaven? And the room got real quiet. You could hear a pin drop. And he finally droned on, no, we don't see animals in heaven. Animals don't have souls. I began to consciously think, I don't believe this stuff. It's human supremacy. We're made in the image of God. And since I've become an atheist, I realized that we made God in the image of ourselves. I remember asking my dad if animals felt pain because I had to do painful things to the farm animals. And he said, oh, no, they don't feel pain like we do. We built the ideology of human supremacy to make all of this okay with us, to make it emotionally okay. We have this rule, do unto others as you have them do unto you, but it doesn't apply outside of our species. You're not going to deal with overhauling our relations with the natural world unless you're going to recognize that animals are central. And if we can't deal with animals, we can't even get started.
Hi, Jim. How are you?
Good morning. How are you?
Yeah, doing good. Thanks. Doing good. Well, it's a real privilege to get to talk to you today because I've followed your work for a long while. You've inspired many of my guests and you've written a couple of books with one of my other guests, Peter Singer, as well. So it's great to have the chance to have a conversation with you today. And as I've explained briefly, this is a series of conversations about what I think of as the deepest philosophical questions. Questions like what's real and how should we best understand the world? And just as importantly, the questions of what matters and who matters, ethics, morality, good, bad, right, and wrong. And, ultimately, how can we lead a good life? And I have an obvious bias because I'm trying to popularize and develop what I think of as a really simple pluralistic worldview that I'm calling Sentientism, which on the what's real question suggests we should take a naturalistic approach using evidence and reason, information from reality to try and understand it with humility. And on the ethical side, it's quite open-minded about the ethical system, but it does insist that every sentient being at least should count seriously in our moral consideration. So I summarize it as evidence, reason, and compassion for all sentient beings as a headline. But in these conversations, I'm talking to a dazzling variety of different people, some of whom agree and some of whom don't with that worldview. So it'll be really interesting to understand your own philosophical journey in answering those big questions and what implications they have for how we might be able to make a better world too. But before we get onto those big questions, how would you best introduce yourself and your work for those who don't know you already?
I am perhaps unique among animal activists in that I was raised on a farm. And as is obvious from my face, I'm quite old. I'm 84 years old now.
I wouldn't have put you past 55, Jim.
Well, I live well. I've been a vegetarian since 1955 and a vegan most of the time, so that didn't hurt.
Yeah.
No, I was born in 1940. I was a baby when World War II broke out. When the Nazis were bombing cities in England, I was, a toddler, a baby. And my family went from living in the city to living on a farm in rural Missouri. So I was brought up doing farm chores, milking cows, killing chickens, the whole 9 yards of rural life in 1940s and 1950s America. So that was my childhood. And the other part of that was religious indoctrination. I came from a family of Bible thumpers. I had to be in church every time the door was open. And it was a Methodist church founded by John Wesley, who I understand was a vegetarian back in the day, in his early days in England. So anyway, I had the dual indoctrination of farm culture, farm work, farm values, and religion, the most intense Christian indoctrination. So I was brought up on human supremacy and using animals, and animal exploitation was a way of life. In fact, it was our livelihood. So that's the base of my life. And I branched out from that somewhat later. I don't know if you want to get into that later discussion, but until I was about probably in my early 30s, I never really departed from that agrarian mentality. I still ate animals. I had given up the church stuff. That's an interesting anecdote. I became an atheist in Sunday school. In church, I was sitting there, I was mourning the loss of my beloved dog, Butch, who was my main companion. Butch was a brother to me. I began to fear for his loss because he was getting old, and I asked the preacher that day in Sunday school, will I see Butch in heaven? And the room got real quiet. You could hear a pin drop, and he finally droned on, no, we don't see animals in heaven. Animals don't have souls. And I swear I'm telling the truth. By the time the service was over, I began to consciously think, I am an atheist. I don't believe this stuff.
Wow. In that moment.
Yeah. And then I went to college at 17, already a committed atheist. I have since graduated from atheism to anti-theism. I don't like any form of theism. I think it's superstition. It's unscientific. It's anti-science. So we'll find a better kind of base for our spirituality other than superstition.
Thank you. Well, you queued up some of the framework of the discussion beautifully there already. And I guess the other thing that people will be aware of, your work, you've been an attorney, you're a writer, you're an activist, you've written a number of books, countless articles, you're in the Animal Rights Hall of Fame. So I'm sure many of my listeners and watchers will know that body of work too. But you've queued up the first of these big philosophical questions nicely already, the question of what's real. And I tend to focus more on epistemology, how do we know things, rather than necessarily a list of the beliefs. But at the same time, an interesting way into it is the topic you've already queued up, which is that of religion and the supernatural, because it's probably the most culturally powerful example of maybe a non-naturalistic way of thinking, one that is often grounded, not always, but often grounded in faith or revelation or authority instead of evidence and reason. So it's quite an interesting test case. And you talked about the fact you grew up in a sort of deeply Christian context. What variety of Christianity was that? And I'm interested in how you would summarize that worldview as you understood it then and as you accepted it then, both in terms of the thing, how you're supposed to believe, what you're supposed to believe, and what were the values and the ethics that came through that worldview. If it's possible to summarize that worldview that you taught as a kid.
Well, I think in as few words as possible, it's human supremacy. We're made in the image of God. And since I've become an atheist, I realize that we made God. We made God in the image of ourselves. We think God created the world, and we turned that around, that we created a God that looked like us to give us power over the world. So it's all turned upside down for me. I was brought up on Old Testament stuff. My family, my church wasn't what we would call Christian nationalist today or fundamentalist. We were just good old mainstream Protestants, small town, rural America, Protestant church during the era of segregation, of course, and women's oppression had not occurred to us yet. Women were all what we call trad wives, traditional. The Germans have the word Kinderküche, Kirche, church, children, kitchen. So I was brought up in all that. Yeah, that's the epistemology I was brought up on, was like believing in God and believing in the Bible and believing that Jesus would save us, that we were sinful and we had to come to church, to purge ourselves of sin. There's a whole system to train us to behave, according to the so-called Christian values. And so I was into that until I went to college, and went to college to study medicine.
And before we come on to college and your transition away, I guess, so it was, I guess, traditional Christian Protestant value set in that context in terms of a hierarchy between, I guess, ultimately God, but then humans very much at the next level of the hierarchy, and then everybody else below. But even within the humans, there is an implied hierarchy there about traditional roles for women. And, as you said, no doubt linked into the themes of segregation, there's a common theme where in some ways of thinking, there are very many Homo sapiens who don't quite get to count as humans. And so there's even a hierarchy there. So I guess that was some of the moral structure. I presume there was the heaven and hell as the sort of ultimate punishment type context as well.
Hellfire.
Yeah.
Hellfire, damnation.
I'm interested in the epistemology as well, because was it very much an unquestioned faith? And, the Bible is the authority, and, no doubt the pastor or the priest locally represents that for you. Or was there any accommodation for evidence and reasoning in a scientific worldview, or was that seen as a separate domain?
Well, in my church, in a small town church, a small town culture, there wasn't a lot of intellectual discussion. It's not like we discussed epistemology in Sunday school. It was just biblical Bible verses. We had to memorize Bible verses. We didn't get to think much or discuss things. Like if we brought up one of these subjects in Sunday school, the minister or somebody would probably tell us to shut up, that we have to focus on the Bible and the scriptures. So there wasn't any kind of curiosity or inquiry that was out of context. It was all study the Bible, listen to the sermon, pray, follow the 10 Commandments. There wasn't any questioning. I didn't even hear the word epistemology until I was in college.
Yeah, thank you.
So we had a very structured worldview. It was all set by the church and the farm life. And it was like we were superior. God said so. God gave us license to do whatever we want with animals and people of color and women and so on.
Yeah. And on the ethical side, was there any recognition of the tension between this sort of hierarchical structure, as you said, talking about segregation and people of color and women and, and non-believers on the one hand, and then love thy neighbor as thyself and compassion, universal compassion, and God being perfectly loving? Was there a sense of tension around that at all for you as a child or in the community? Or
it's a good question. I think there would have been a tension if we recognized the cognitive dissonance. Like I remember, especially in my church during the wars, Vietnam and so forth, the routine was most of the churches that I knew, it was different in cities. The church didn't want to talk about that. They didn't want to talk about the morality of our army, killing people in Asia. If you brought that up, it was stifled. The discussion would be killed right there on the spot because they didn't want to create that tension that you're talking about. They didn't want us to think about how what we were doing was immoral according to what we'd been taught. They wanted to keep it separate. They wanted to enforce the cognitive dissonance, the separation of reality of what we were doing, of all of the colonial wars that we were sponsoring, and what Jesus was teaching us. Jesus was teaching us to love our neighbor, to be kind, the Good Samaritan, all that stuff. But we never applied it to the reality of what we were doing because people didn't talk about that stuff. Didn't come up.
Yeah, thank you. And another interesting question I find in different religious worldviews is, what's actually driving the morality and the compassion? Because, there are challenges with lots of different religious worldviews, but there is some good in all of them. And that tends to be that they do nearly always, in some way, shape or form, talk about compassion and caring about others. But there's an interesting distinction between whether that caring for others is done just because we are intrinsically moral beings and it's the right thing to do to care for others, or whether we're caring for others because it's commanded by God and we're really being moral because of obedience and fear. What was the balance in the story you were told as a kid about, why should we be good? Was it obedience or was it just an independent morality?
Obedience, I think, more than anything else. We were not encouraged to think for ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, that's the theme that runs through both the facts and the ethics. Is questioning was not welcomed. Yeah,
we were not allowed to do that in small town rural America. It was like you didn't question the norms that were being posed on you. If you did that, you probably would have been punished or, talked out of it. It's not something you're supposed to do. I remember it wasn't a religious issue, but I remember asking my dad, I must have been 5 or 6 or 7 years old, if animals felt pain, because I had to do painful things to the farm animals. And he said, oh, no, they don't feel pain like we do. So that's a set of facts were planted in my head, non-facts, anti-facts, simply because an authority figure told me this. So I had to believe that. And I didn't question it anymore after that.
Yeah. So the cracks appeared, as you said, at that moment when you were told your dog wasn't going to go to heaven because they didn't have a soul, and you, I guess, almost became an atheist in that moment. And you talked about at college your thinking developed as well. So what was your journey like moving away from that religious worldview, and how challenging was that, both psychologically and socially, given how central religion was to family, friends, and community around you?
Before I left home to go to college, I'd already become fascinated with biology because I wanted to be a doctor. I was going to go to medical school. So I devoted myself to the study of biology, anatomy, physiology, even before I started college. When I got to college, of course, I majored in biology subjects. So I learned so much more about the reality revealed by the science of biology. And of course, it clashed with all I'd been told. The church doctrines and the farm doctrines, animals don't feel pain, animals are put here for us to use, that began to come undone as I became more knowledgeable in biology. And of course, learning about Darwin's theory of evolution really kind of blasts away that biblical Old Testament crap. The creation story just evaporates when you begin to understand Darwin. So I was really invested in biological science, and that bolstered my atheism, made me more confident in believing in material reality. And then I just, because of my knowledge of science and my respect for the scientific method, which unfortunately the animal movement often has a strain of thought that they're hostile to science, because for animal rights people, science means experimentation and the torture of animals in laboratories. Yes, that happens, but that's just a kind of science. Science is a method. It's a tool. It's a discipline for understanding the world around us. And we have many branches of science. We have geology, we have astronomy, we have biology, physics, chemistry. We have so many sciences. And if we use those tools, then we have a true understanding of the world, and not the myth and superstition, which is passed on in the Bible and folk tales and everything else. So I became a scientist, and I am to this day.
And did you find that refreshing and freeing, or did you find it difficult? And was it socially challenging for you? Or had you sort of, because you were at college and you'd moved, from your community, that was a easy, clean break?
It was like discovering wonderful things. It was like finding paradise, because now I could explore and understand things that were forbidden before. I really began to enjoy knowing science and understanding what was happening in the world. And I became more and more curious. And of course, my scientific bent fed my curiosity, because I would read more and more. The more I got curious about something, and we'll get into that and talk about the book, the curiosity of animals, of animal domestication, of agriculture. How did it start? Why did it start? I just devoured that stuff. And I try to be as scientific as I can in the material I use in my books. I don't apply myth and superstition and mystical nonsense. It's pure science as much as I can find it. Anthropology mostly.
Yeah, we'll come back to that. And as you say, one of the interesting things in these conversations is I interview people who still have a religious worldview today, but many of my guests started out with a religious worldview that they were basically given by their parents and local society. and then have moved away from that religious worldview. And some have become, pretty much straight down the line, naturalistic, atheists or strong agnostics. I guess I count myself in that camp. But some others have moved away from a traditional religious worldview, but they still feel a strong pull towards something beyond or transcendent or mystical. And they find themselves in a space where they're maybe, not religious, but spiritual, or there is something mystical. Have you ever felt drawn towards those things at all? Or was it very much a sort of, right, science is my way forward?
I am interested in that. Part of my scientific thinking tells me that I think there's a need for something like that. I think that's part of the human animal, is the need, some kind of a belief or some understanding that's bigger than us. We want to feel a great power, and throughout history and prehistory, we've invented this. We used to call it superstition back in the Stone Age, when they believed in mystical powers of the nature, superstitions, we call it. Those we've kind of abandoned those in favor of science, but they're interesting in a way to me because they tell us a lot about the way people thought and saw the world back in those days. Even though it's superstition, it has to be given some value. And when we think of superstition, what little we Americans know of those views of the world, we see in the Native American people, the tribes of the Plains Indians, and the other people we call Indians, the native people of the Americas. And we know something about the way they saw the world and the way they really admired and respected and were in awe of the natural world around them. They lived off of it. They respected it. They didn't take more than they needed. And we need some of that. We need to capture some of their spirituality, some of their feelings about the world, the natural world, the living world, but without the unscientific, superstitious stuff. For example, we know they believed in shape-shifting. They believed, some of the native tribes believed that animals and humans could change shape and change form. And, it's kind of interesting to think about that, the werewolf, the vampire, that sort of thing. It kind of amuses us to think that way. But we know in the real world, in reality, that doesn't happen. So we need to be scientific about it. It's an interesting phenomenon. But it does tell us something about, maybe they did admire animals in a way that we ought to try to understand. Maybe they saw something there that is really important.
And I like the way you put it. It's more about the feeling than the facts. And my sense is that we can capture that feeling of awe and wonder and transcendence and majesty while still having a completely scientific, naturalistic worldview. So I've run workshops about worldviews with kids here in the UK, for example, and I did one last week, and you can just see that their eyes go wide when you explain how many stars there are in the galaxy, or how many galaxies there are in the universe, or you explain that the banana they had for breakfast is their cousin, and it's just like, oh my God, that's mind blowing. It's more like a Carl Sagan type of awe and wonder than it is anything that requires magic or fabrications or.
And yes, and you can have good feelings about that.
Yeah, it's the same feeling I think a religious person would feel. Yeah.
Yeah. For me, it's important to do that because it makes us feel a membership in the world around us, and not apart from it, as worldview has taught us, is that we're superior, and all of that stuff, all of those things are the other, and there's no connection. We're separate and apart, but I think it's good for us to see the world with the feeling that you describe. And we have a spiritual, what is spiritual? It's a feeling about the big things that we don't understand. The more I know about our evolution as a hominid, as a human primate, the more I feel a membership in the family of animals. I feel that connection, and it makes me feel at home here. Whereas human beings, especially what happened in our election recently, makes me not feel such a healthy, warm and fuzzy membership in the human species. I think I'd rather be an animal.
Yeah, there's hope when we look at humanity, but quite a lot of despair too, unfortunately. So yeah, but and I like that approach too, because that sense of feeling, awe and wonder and curiosity, and because it also helps to counteract this sense that a naturalistic or a scientific worldview has to be cold and clinical and intellectual and emotionless. That just isn't true, right? That's not how I feel it. I don't think that's how you feel it either. So thank you.
Well, it's important context to feel that way about the living world around us, because the training and the indoctrination and the worldview that's been pushed on us has been to separate us from that. And the intellectuals of the 20th century and people who are scholarly will know their names. Almost all of them worried about and wrote about the problem of humans' alienation from nature. Alienation from nature is built into our worldview because the way we invented the superior God and the superior ourselves as superior. We've disconnected. We've alienated ourselves from the natural order. We don't like it. It's a thing for us to use. It's our slave. So we don't feel a connection. But the more I've studied biology and science, I do see the facts of that, the reality of that membership and that connection, that evolutionary continuity, I call it. So it makes me feel a little more warm and fuzzy about living on the planet than I would otherwise as cold clinical atheist. So yes, I think you're right. There is a need for that kind of spirituality, but not superstitions.
It's like spirituality, but with no spirits.
Exactly. But with a scientific understanding of the larger world, as you had described just minutes ago, it's awesome.
Yeah. Properly awesome. Yeah. In the meaning of that word. Yeah.
Absolutely. And if you look at the anthropology on this, our distant ancestors, we're talking thousands of years ago, they felt the same way. They were awed by the heavens. They were in awe of the forces they saw around them. They didn't understand them. They tried to understand them. They were very curious. So they invented superstitions to explain things. They invented supernatural beings, gods, or whatever. And that's the way they dealt with the awe that they felt for the living world. We can have that feeling today, but really understanding what's going on out there.
Yeah, and being curious to find out more. So let's come on to the second big question, which is moving from epistemology more to questions of ethics and morality. And I sometimes break this up into a sort of what matters question. What's the foundation of morality? What do good and bad and right and wrong even mean? But that often blurs into the second part of the question, which is, and who gets to matter, right? How broad is our moral scope? So it'd be interesting to understand, as you described already, the sort of moral grounding that you were taught as a Protestant Christian growing up. And as you moved away from that worldview, many people who go through that journey then have a real crisis of morality, because as they lose the belief in the faith, all of their moral foundations crumble at the same time, and they have to sort of feel like they've got to rebuild from scratch. Whereas others will then take parts of the religious worldview, for example, universal compassion, and just continue with that. How did your moral journey, thinking about those deep questions of right and wrong and good and bad, change as you left Christianity? And how have you come to think about that stuff now?
I didn't really understand the basis of morality until somewhat recently. I did follow, like in college and other readings, I did follow all of the philosophers, the rationalists, Aristotle, Plato, all of the discussions in the Western canon of morals and ethics. And, there's thousands and thousands of gallons of ink.
Oh, yeah. And they haven't stopped yet either.
Paper and ink that's been devoted to the intellectualizing of morals and ethics. And my own sometime writing partner, Peter Singer, of course, is a major contributor to this, like his utilitarian view, and then Tom Reagan's rights view. And then we got so many intellectuals trying to figure out the morals and ethics and the basis thereof. And it occurred to me somewhat recently, again, reading anthropology, that I think they evolved in the tribal setting, and the oldest human community is a small group, a kin-based group, essentially an extended family. We call it the Stone Age people and the Paleolithic, thousands of years ago, before agriculture. They had morals and ethics that they had evolved through, I guess, trial and error, through experimentation. And they found out what worked and what didn't work. I mean, they found out that if people tend to be selfish, nobody eats. They had a big, big value on sharing anything that you find to eat. So that helped sustain that group. It made them more successful than some other group that where selfishness prevailed and they die out because their lifestyle, their gathering of food, whether it be nuts and berries or later when it became hunters, sharing a kill and materials, sharing materials, actually improved the survival of that small group. So that I think my theory of morality is that it evolved along with technology. They tried things. If they worked, they were more successful. If they didn't try some of these norms and rules of living, the group didn't function. It didn't flourish. It didn't survive in their environments. And I just read a great paper on hunter-gatherers. We choose the word forager today instead of hunter-gatherer. They lived off their environment. It was very important to them for survival to know everything about their immediate environment. They had to know where the food was, where the danger was, where the shelter was. And the only way they could really be successful, you couldn't be successful as an individual. You had to be with a group. You had to have that shared knowledge. You had to have that workforce. You had to have that group cohesion for people to live well and to survive against the elements and the predators and the dangers and the diseases. So I think that, in my view, morality evolved culturally because it helped that group be more successful than a group that didn't have those values. And the chief value was sharing. They had to keep the numbers small. They had to be mobile. They had to keep moving, so they didn't build permanent structures. They didn't build up surpluses because they didn't need to store food because it was all around them. They just need to know how to read the seasons and read the environment to find food. So the thing that made them successful was knowing all of that as a group and sharing that knowledge and expanding that knowledge and then sharing resources, whether it be food items or materials, stones, hides, sticks, weapons, whatever they had, shelters. They shared everything and they kept their numbers down. So that, to me, that is the real evolution of morals and ethics, is that it's just by trial by error and experience and living. And by the time we discover writing, 3000 BC, these rules began to be written down. And the Hebrews wrote them down in the Old Testament. And the Sumerians, the Code of Hammurabi, was that Sumerian?
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. And other cultures. I don't know the history of the Asian morality as well, but I'm sure that they had some of their famous names that wrote down what was already understood. It was already there. It was the word of mouth. It was an oral tradition. And it was enforced generation by generation. And then when we become writers and thinkers, somebody writes all that down. I think in a Hebrew tradition, it would have been the scribes or the rabbis started writing down what they were already living by. They codified what was understood among them. So that's my view on the evolution of morals and ethics.
And I think as a descriptive story about how morality came into being, that rings true to me. And I mean, you could take the story even earlier than that, in that, you know, arguably non-human animals for many millions of years before humans even existed had some of the rudiments of, you know, morality. They weren't writing PhDs, right? But you know, at least in the mammal species, a mother cares for their child, and there are group dynamics, and there's sharing, and there's collaboration, and so on. So in a sense, the descriptive roots of morality are ancient, and they evolved biologically and then culturally as well through the human species, and arguably some non-human species as well, as they do today. But at some point, do you see that there's a break between the sort of that descriptive story about how morality has come to be and the normative story of what it should be? Because part of the difficulty about the descriptive story of morality as being something that has just evolved because it proved to be evolutionarily adaptive is that there's a lot of good there: collaboration, sharing, cooperation, caring for kin and group members. But there's also violence, outgroup discrimination, brutal hierarchy, alpha male dynamics, and those sort of prove evolutionary adaptive as well. So there are some people who will say, well, yeah, that's descriptively the story of how morality came to be. And that is also my normative morality. So I think might makes right. And it's the survival of the fittest. And if I'm powerful and violent, then I can use that for, to spread my own progeny across the land, right? So how do you think about that break between the descriptive, which might be more transactional, more evolutionary, more adaptive, and whether there's a normative space where we go, that's great, but how do we think things should be from maybe it's never completely separate, but a sort of purer is there a purer standpoint that we can aspire to normatively?
I think that's the question before us, considering the tensions and the anxiety of the age that we're living through now, which is political chaos, international conflicts and squabbles over resources, climate crisis. We really need to come to terms with some kind of morality that's going to be universal, that's going to bind us together instead of dividing us the way we are divided today over religion. Much of the wars in the Middle East are over Allah versus Yahweh versus Jesus. Religion adds a lot to this division.
Yeah, at least exacerbates some of those problems, yeah.
Yeah. Now, Darwin did write about some of the things you just mentioned, about morality, empathy in animals. It wasn't the origin of a species. It might have been the descent of man or the origin of emotions in animals. He wrote a lot about the evolutionary benefit of animals sharing food and aiding each other. Kropotkin wrote about it in some of his Mutual Aid, I think was the book, the Anarchist Bible. So there is some of that in nature where animals help each other. And I think that's, it improved their survival. But anyway, to get back to your question, I think we probably need to have a better understanding of the antiquity of our moral system, even the prehistoric roots of it. We tend to think that everything starts with writing, that we really didn't become civilized until Samaria and Rome and Greece and all of that. A lot of stuff was already settled with human views of the world and morality by the time we start writing 3000 BC. So I think it's important to look at what were we doing before that, before it became codified in the Code of Hammurabi and the Old Testament and so forth. There are roots. There are anthropological roots to our morality, which we need to understand. We don't need to throw off all of that as just old-fashioned superstition. Some of that stuff could be very important to us in understanding how to get along in the world. One of the most important norms or values that I saw when I was reading this piece about hunter-gatherers is they had something else that's not mentioned very often. Of course, everyone knows that they did sharing and they kept the group small, but they also had what they call leveling practices. They wanted to maintain equality, egalitarian. They wanted to maintain the same status throughout. They didn't want somebody to emerge as bigger and more important and more powerful than the others. So they had what they call leveling practices to keep somebody from getting too big for their britches, from somebody getting to have too much power over the group. And these were things that we would recognize as shaming. For example, the example they gave was if the mighty hunter brought back like an exceptionally great carcass for a feast, instead of celebrating that person, that probably a guy, a hunter, they basically shamed him and kept him from getting, too full himself for doing that. And he was made to get down to earth and become among his peers and not be the big guy, not be the boss. So they had a lot of those kind of rules, I guess you'd call them, to keep people from getting too elite, to establish a hierarchy.
So there's some themes there about, turning back to some of those roots and looking for wisdom there. There's collaboration, there's sharing, there's cooperation, there's some sense of egalitarianism. But does that perspective mean that you don't sign up to any of the sort of classical schools of modern ethical philosophy. So, as you said, your co-author Peter Singer's utilitarianism, or a Kantian approach, or deontological approach, or a feminist care ethic, or a virtue ethic. Are you not sort of engaged in those choices, or?
No, it's important to understand them, but I think in continuity with maybe the roots of those ideas, like there is a kind of a universal, the golden rule is sort of common to every culture: do unto others as you would have them do it. This is a universal rule, and it can be expressed maybe 1,000 ways in 1,000 languages, but it all comes down to some same simple understanding. You don't hurt others. You don't make yourself powerful over others. We have a lot of, these are just ancient understandings. Now, the philosophers, especially if you have a job in academia, if you're a paid professor, you have to write papers, you have to write books. So they discuss this stuff and dissect it into almost minutiae and dazzle the minds of grad students everywhere with a whole new theory on the origins of morality. It's just wonderful to see how they just keep spinning it and spinning it and spinning. I like to bring it down to the basics that have been there for probably thousands of years and understand them in a context with all this space age philosophy of ethics, and just get real, people. We've been doing this for 200,000-300,000 years.
And the basics are the most important, I think. I like that perspective because, and that's partly why I frame the sentientism worldview as quite pluralistic ethically, because for me, almost definitionally, morality is about whether and how we care about others, right? And you can express that through the golden rule or even the platinum rule, where we don't treat others how we want to be treated. We treat them how they want to be treated, which I think can be another step forward. And that's super simple. It's something even a 5-year-old can understand. And yes, I think you could put that into practice through deontology or feminist care ethic or a virtue ethic or a utilitarian system. That's fine. But it's the basics that's most important. Is it's basically about, our concern for others. Yeah. And I think that can run through all sorts of complex philosophical theories, right? But the 5-year-old understanding of it sums it up best for me, right?
Yeah. We can make it big and complex, but we can also reduce it to it's to live well in safety, with some degree of happiness and some degree of a sense of being a member of this wonderful thing that's so awesome. To be a member of life on the planet makes us want to do better and live better and take care of each other better.
Yeah, exactly. And that brings me neatly on to this second part of the question, because you're talking about being a member and being a part of rather than being apart from. And I was talking about some form of care or compassion or moral consideration for others. But then a really important question that I think is deeply neglected, even in a lot of the moral, philosophical, academic work, is, okay, who gets to count as an other? And I'm only an amateur in this space, but I have read a lot of moral philosophy, and the vast majority of books and papers written about philosophy unthinkingly assume our moral scope is just humans. So I've got a book downstairs by David Wiggins called Ethics, right? And it's 600 pages long. And it talks about, front to back, left to right, everything you could ever want to know about ethics. And the word animal doesn't even appear in the index, right? It's just not even considered at all. So, I mean, you and I, we share this agenda, so it's obvious where we're going. But I'm interested in your journey on that moral scope question, because some people get stuck even within subgroups of humanity, right? And we know the problems of homophobia and casteism and racism and sexism and in-group, out-group dynamics that are still deep, deep problems in humanity today. But there's obviously this other challenge of people just getting stuck with humanity too. So I'm interested in your journey thinking about moral scope, even again, as you were a kid, right? How did you start to think about your family and your friends, the community around you? How did you start to think more broadly about humanity? And given your experience on the farm, what were the breakthroughs of your thinking about, oh my God, non-humans matter too? What was that overall journey like on moral scope?
Some of that line of thinking began to occur to me when I was doing the research. that became the book, A Natural Order, which I started in the early 1980s. And it was mind-boggling for years because I couldn't read enough to try to understand how did animal domestication come to be? How did we pick out animals out of the natural world and enslave them and put them in pens and shackles and shape their bodies through animal husbandry? When I began to read all of that stuff, that's when it began to occur to me that that book really is about the formation or the evolution of the idea of human supremacy. How did we move from living in nature and feeling a part of the animal world, being a member, as the native tribes did? How did we move from that to this idea of God that created us to be owners of everything? And that happened because of agriculture. I think everybody knows by now, it's almost common knowledge that agriculture, which starts about 11,000 years ago, really changed the way we see the world. It was the most disruptive development in all of human existence. And many writers have said as much. The famous Jared Diamond wrote a famous article a few years ago, Agriculture, the Greatest Mistake in the Human History. It disrupted everything. It changed the way we saw ourselves and the world. It changed the way we saw the differences among us, different colors, different peoples, different tribes, sex. Everything changed because of this move toward agriculture, raising our own food, living in one place, living in groups and communities and cities. So when I began to do that research, that's when it began to dawn on me, the idea that we built human supremacy. We built the ideology of human supremacy to make all of this okay with us, to make it emotionally okay. We had been living in nature. We were in awe of the world around us. If we killed an animal, we had to have rituals. We had to have ceremonies. There was a greater deal of emotional tension for forager people around hunting. They didn't do it the way we think today, where they just go out and kill something. They had to have ceremonies. And even after agriculture, when they had animal sacrifice, they didn't do it numbly and blindly and thoughtlessly. They had to make a big thing about it. They had to have a lot of dancing and a lot of chanting and ceremony and ritual to kind of diffuse that emotional tension. So it began to occur to me that this is how we invented this idea that we're supreme over all the life in the world. And the example you gave of this 600-page book that talked about ethics is strictly confined to the Homo sapiens population. Doesn't apply to anything else. That's what I call human exceptionalism. Human supremacy and exceptionalism. We're not a part of all of that. We're exceptional creatures. God made us to have ownership of everything. So all of the thinking and philosophy so far has been not only human supremacists, but human exceptionalists. We don't think of ourselves in continuity with everything else. We have this rule, do unto others as you have them do unto you, but it doesn't apply outside of our species because that's just another big piece of this human supremacy thing. And I call it exceptionalism. It's what separates us from our animal cousins. It's what makes us unique. And they love to talk about human uniqueness. Let's talk about uniqueness. Did you realize, do people know that the elephant is unique? The elephant is unique, just like the human species is unique. Every species, every creature is unique.
And just as evolved as we are, yeah.
It means one of a kind. The leopard is unique because if it weren't one of a kind, it would be something else. So the idea that we're unique is really absurd because we're all species are unique in that sense. But to get to your point about the continuity of ethics and morals, if we saw the world, if we saw ourselves in membership with the larger world as a member of the family of animals as we are apes, we have genetic continuity. We have evolutionary continuity with other life. They have some of the same capacities that we have. And this is where you talk about sentience. We know that other animals have sentience to a degree. They don't write philosophical texts and they don't invent rockets to Mars or whatever, but they certainly have awareness and they do have their own kind of level of sentience. And if we could understand that more, this golden rule that we're talking about, do unto others as you would have them do unto, we recognize that animals suffer. And they suffer from some of the same causes of suffering that we do: loneliness, depression. Animals in the shelter, all you have to do is go into an animal shelter and look at the eyes of these dogs that have been dumped. If you can't see that, you're just not human. You're not real.
Yeah. And personally, what was your journey like going from, you were farming the animals, you were eating animals, you clearly had a deep relationship with the dog that led you to, atheism when you learned they weren't going to go to heaven. What was that sort of journey for you like at a younger age as you started to think more broadly about the implications of animals being sentient, valid others? Again, was that a long, slow, painful journey, or was there a light bulb moment?
There was an upheaval in thinking and feelings. I'm about to publish a book now, which I call, the tentative title is Madness, and it's about the madness of the present age, the climate crisis, this madness. Our human supremacy, our human sense of ownership of the world has brought us to the brink of, I don't have to elaborate, everybody knows. We're killing the life on the planet for our own benefit, so that now it's not for our benefit at all. We're going to be wiped out by our own doing. So we have to look at this, a hard look at what we're doing. And this idea that we're supreme over the planet has got to go. It's not evolutionary beneficial. We talked earlier about the mores of the forager group, how they come up with rules that enhance their survival. We're not doing that now. We're following civilization's values on conquest and expansion and human supremacy and accept that are killing us and are killing the planet. So if we don't stop and think about what we're doing a little bit better and overhauling our ethics a little bit, yeah, it's doom and gloom ahead of us, and it's already happening. It's not something in the distant future. The climate crisis is here now, so the sooner we can act, the better we'll be. But anyway, I'm rambling on here, but let's talk about how I changed my thinking. Was really understanding the process of domestication, how one species took power over all others for its own benefit. That's what we did. When we domesticated animals, we learned to take them out of their native habitat, the mountains of what's now southern Turkey, sheep, goats, eventually cattle, horses, everything else. We brought them under our control. We made them our property. We built up surpluses in them. We made our wealth by increasing the size of the herd. We had more sheep, we had more wool, we had more milk, we sold cheese. We made ourselves really wealthy off the backs of animals.
I heard you say in another interview that the word capital comes from head count, ultimately, of livestock and potentially even, human enslaved people, right?
Yeah, this is a point. I didn't make this up. This is in the anthropology. There's more than a few writers who have noted this. If you read Keith Thomas's famous work, Man in the Natural World, it came out in the 80s, I think, or the 70s. A lot of writers have noticed this, that when we began to accumulate herds of animals under our control, they were the first form of money because they were tradable. We traded other things, of course, but to have a steady supply of wool and meat and milk to trade with the cities, the people that had that, sheep and goats, they had a kind of wealth that nobody else had. So they become, and they measured their wealth in the number of animals that they owned or controlled. And some say that writing begins with counting, because it became, even before we wrote philosophical treatises and textbooks, we had to record transactions. That's what trade is all about. When you go to the city and sell like 20 or 30 lambs, there has to be an account made. There has to be a receipt. So they had to learn to count animals. And the more animals you had, the more wealth you had, because the more animals were money. There's an old word for cattle. They think of a Roman word from cattle as pecuniary, which was a word for cows, because their wealth was measured in the number of cows they had. So we have that word today, pecuniary, and capital, to measure of wealth. And it's head count.
You can see how it all links together, right? The roots are there, and the themes flow through. Now, there's an interesting challenge to using sentience to set moral scope, which is obviously the core of the sentientism idea, that at least every sentient being should matter, and that translates pretty directly into a concern for animals. But actually, one of the first times the word sentientism was used was to criticize it. And it was criticized from people who weren't saying, no, we should just go back to humans and anthropocentrism. They were saying your sentientism isn't going far enough. So this was people like John Rodman and others saying, actually, what we need is a biocentrism that cares intrinsically for all living things, even if they're not sentient, or an ecocentrism, which cares about the entire ecosystem, even including rocks, rivers, and trees and things that aren't even alive. And in a way, the modern environmental movement talk as though they're answering your call, right? You're saying, we've created an unnatural order, and the modern environmental movement is saying, yes, absolutely right. Nature is a wonderful thing. We need to go back to nature. We need a broad, holistic ecosystem with the earth as Gaia. What do you think the modern environmental movement is getting wrong?
They're excluding animals. The burning question of this century and the past was what they call, if you've read this stuff, they call it the nature question. Practically every famous intellectual has written about man's alienation from nature. They call it the nature question. And they all keep going in circles about how do we resolve the problem of man and the natural world. And it's because they refuse to consider animals as important beings. We have no idea, not even animal rights people, have a glimmer of an idea of how important animals have been in our evolution. And I don't mean as food. I mean as powerful other beings that were respected and admired. And I give the example in the book of the creation stories of the indigenous people the world over. Indigenous people, native peoples, see animals as the creators of life on the planet. Animals came first. They call them first beings. They were here before humans. Humans come along, superstitions vary, but animals teach us how to live, how to build fire, how to find water, how to find shelter. And we've lost that idea of how animals have been important in our existence, in our evolution. And I elaborate on this a lot more in the book, A Natural Order. It's no wonder that the first paintings, the art was on the walls of the caves for 35,000 years. They didn't paint trees and rocks. They painted animals. And they painted animals that were impressive, animals that caused awe and respect and wonder. That's what they painted on the wall. So animals are very outstanding. Picture yourself a Stone Age person or earlier, 30, 40, 50,000 years ago, 70,000 years ago, when we were creeping out of Africa into the rest of the world, modern humans. When we were living out there in nature, probably not a lot of elaborate shelters and structures. We were exposed to the elements 24/7. Animals stimulated us. When we looked out in the world, what did we see? What did we hear? What did we smell? It was animals. Animals animated the world around us. And what did we see? We saw continuity. We look out and see a herd of bison somewhere, antelope in Africa. And we see animals are eating, they're munching, they're chewing, they're swallowing, they're pissing, they're shitting, they're having sex. And we could identify with that. These are the things that we're doing. And some have interviewed Native American people. How did they see animals? Some say they saw them as other people with different languages. They didn't see them as separate, as other, And they base their superstitions and their stories and their creation stories on their interactions with animals, and they're being absolutely impressed by animals that could do things that they couldn't. I mean, you see a leopard can chase down an animal and jump 15 feet up into a tree and eat it, and they had to be impressed. Even though they couldn't be leopards, they had to think, wow, that is some amazing animal.
It's just a different way of seeing them, yeah.
Yeah. The best book on it, which is kind of an anathema to most animal rights people, is by Paul Shepard. Paul Shepard wrote a book in 1978 called, the title is Thinking Animals, Animals and the Evolution of Human Intelligence. And that book, an entire book, is devoted to how animals shaped the mind in human beings as the brain and the mind was evolving to its present state. And animals were critical players, the most important sources of thought. Shepard says that we were so in awe of animals, we were so wondering about animals, like they were like us, and yet they were not like us. They were the other, and yet they were not the other. It caused this dynamic of thought, trying to figure out who are they and what are they doing. So it's an obscure idea. I mean, we understand, most of us understand that agriculture changed the world, but we don't really understand how much animals and the domestication of animals is the biggest piece of that. Because when we took power with these animals that we had been admiring for thousands of years, they were the central figures in most of our stories about the world. Animals are nature in that mind. We didn't distinguish between animals and nature. Nature is kind of a modern concept. It's kind of an abstraction. I call it the living world. It's just full of living beings, and they are animated, and they move, and they do things, and they cause us to wonder. So we have to try to understand how that, we call it the primitive mind, the prehistoric mind, how they saw these other creatures. And it really is important for us to see how important animals have been as our mind becomes the way it is today, the all-knowing intellectual mind that writes papers and books. And we just do, animal rights people just do not, to this day, I've yet to find an activist that really grasps this idea of the importance of animals in the formation of human thought and intelligence and language. I give examples in the book, like one writer examined folklore, and he found that animals are the most frequent inhabitants, the most numerous of the inhabitants of stories. They're all about animals. They're not about rocks and trees and waterfalls and clouds and weather. Animals animate all of our lore, our folklore, our language.
And you can see that running through pretty much every culture.
It is. It's true. It's universal.
Thank you. And in a way, that cues up the final big question about how to make a better world. And I have a bias because I think these ideas of worldviews are deeply important, because whether humans are aware of them or not, or whether they're explicit or not, your worldview individually underpins every decision you take, for good or ill. And that worldview can include, how do you understand reality, and what do you think good and bad and right and wrong are, and who should matter. And in a way, your book, Unnatural Order, it's a story about humans' worldviews and how they've changed over time and why. And that story you tell is compelling, because you talk about, as you said, the sort of pre-agricultural way of thinking about the world, where we were more integrated, and we certainly saw animals as, as others, maybe as other people, maybe even as gods or spirits. And then we shifted through agriculture to think of them as commodities. And you also tell a compelling story about how that transition to farming drove so many changes in our worldview, almost to post-rationalize our treatment of non-human animals, that drove a lot of the classical thinking about hierarchy and supremacy and exploitation, commodification, and arguably runs through into intrahuman ethics too, in terms of sexism, racism, outgroup treatment, colonialism, arguably, in terms of that sort of mindset. So that's a really interesting story that I guess explains, how we got here.
Yeah. That's the point.
And this final question is saying, okay, what the hell do we do now? And one thing that is quite current in today's zeitgeist is a sense that we need to go back, right? So there's this romantic, idealized view of a pre-industrial, pre-agricultural society, which is largely, I think, to some degree based on wishful thinking and idealized romanticism, sometimes a sort of Orientalist fascination with ancient or different cultures and histories that can be a bit patronizing, and sometimes this sort of sense of the noble savage image, right? So that people are like, that's what we need to do. We need to go back. We need to go back to foraging and bartering and pre-industrial societies, and maybe through some as yet unmentioned intervention, radically reduce human population to about 500 million people, and then we can live in harmony with society. So that's one way we could go, is essentially going back. I'm not a fan of that personally, but based on what you've learned about the development of human worldviews through this process, how do you think we can make a better world, and what worldview will help us move in that direction?
Well, again, having the discipline of science, scientific thinking, we know that we're romanticizing the past. We have to accept that, yeah, we look at the good stuff, but we don't. There was cruelty and violence. They abandoned their babies, the forager people. They did things that would be offensive to us today.
And just as evolution is an extremely brutal, uncaring process, so is human behavior if survival and procreation is all we care about.
It wasn't all the Garden of Eden. We killed animals, we butchered animals, we ate animals, we ate each other. It's a common thing. And in some of those cultures, actually begins in the early stages of agriculture. Cannibalism becomes a thing. When you conquer the enemy that's robbing your crops, you not only kill them, you take them back and eat them in front of the tribe to show your dominance over these terrible people over there that speak a different language and have different tattoos than we do. They're other. Yeah, we did terrible things back then. So we can't go back as a matter of science and practicality. We're not going to go back to Stone Age living and forager society. But we do have to look at some of the things about that society that could be useful to us. And these values on sharing the resources, controlling your numbers, leveling practices would be good so that we don't have hierarchies. We don't have like people who have more wealth and more power than everyone else. Even Marx, I think, called the pre-agricultural people primitive communism. They had a rule of like living together, keeping our numbers down, sharing resources, not letting somebody become the big boss. That comes later. That comes in the agricultural period when we have wealth and we have power because of that wealth. So there's important things for us to learn from looking at our pre-agricultural roots. We talked about the evolution of morality, ethics, and rules. One of the things that divides us today is everybody has a different religion or a different set of rules. What if we realize that these are common rules? These existed way before there were religions, way before the Quran and the Torah and all of these other sacred texts. They're just codifying what was already there. Maybe if we could capture that by looking at our distant ancestors, we could see some commonality there, a commonality in our ethics and our morals, which are all about living better, living more peacefully, getting along with each other, not having constant struggles and conflicts. I think we could learn a lot without going back. We can't go back, but we can learn from them.
And on the religious topic, I guess my utopian vision would be, I generally think a naturalistic way of understanding the world gives us the best chance of understanding the world. And if we want to make the world better, that's useful. So I like a naturalistic approach. Hence, that's sentientism is explicitly naturalistic. But most people around the world do have a religious worldview, many, many billions of them. And you described earlier on the idea that you went from being Christian to being atheist to being an anti-theist. And, I'm sure you would acknowledge there are some good elements of all of those religions, as you've just talked about there, right? This idea of the golden rule you'll find in most religions. But at the same time, you see very clearly the strong negatives too. So one option is just persuade everyone to drop religion and become a naturalistic sentientist, right? Good luck. But what paths do you see for religions and religious communities? Do you think there are productive, positive paths that religious communities can take to address the aspects of the ethics that don't fit this universal golden rule, compassionate, connected way of thinking, but double down on the common elements that most of them do share, whether it's mercy or ahimsa or shifting to an idea of compassionate stewardship in Christianity? Do you think there are productive paths that people can follow to maintain that religious community, but to still converge and find some common goal?
I would hope that they would do that. You can't really abolish religion. Every time you try to stamp out a religion, it only gets stronger, because then they feel persecuted. And then they build a whole movement, to fight their persecution. So
it goes against a commitment to a universal compassion, right? Because that should imply, I don't really want to force you to do things unless you're needlessly harming others, right? So I think you should be free to believe, whatever you like, as long as you're not harming others. So I'd sort of agree that, coercion isn't the answer, or banning it isn't the answer, but yeah.
No, you can't really remove them that way. I think what's happening in the scientific age is more and more people who have had the indoctrination that I've had begin to see that, that it's mysticism, that it's supernatural superstition, and God that they imagine is imaginary, and there's not a guy up there that's controlling everything. I think that part of it is dying away. The theist thing, that there's this almighty God, whatever language, whatever culture, they all have one. Usually it's a big, powerful guy who's dressed in warrior clothing, right, to show his power.
Certainly in the Abrahamic religions, yeah.
Yeah, I think that people just don't believe that so much anymore. They just don't believe in that imaginary God.
That can be true even within religious communities. There are many, there are a surprising number of atheists and agnostics even within religious communities, even if they still value the community and the ritual and the connection and so on, yeah.
The Unitarians are the best example I can think of. And I remember having a lot of speaking gigs at Unitarian churches. They seem to have a kind of godless, God-free religion. And it has a lot to do with the teachings of Jesus as expressed in the Sermon on the Mount. These are universal principles of kindness, of mercy, of loving one another, of getting along. This is not rocket science. And you don't need a Torah, an Old Testament, to tell you this.
Yeah. And all of those ways of thinking already have the seeds to extend that compassion beyond the human as well. And it's easier in some religions, the Dharmic religions, with the idea of ahimsa. Ahimsa basically means non-violence, or do no harm. And it doesn't mean do no harm to humans. It means do no harm to any being that can be harmed, which is by definition a sentient being. So in a sense, it's already baked in, and you just got to help the people in those communities and those religions, double down on what they're supposed to already be committed to. I think it's tougher in the Abrahamic religions because they are more about hierarchy. There's God and angels and
doctrine
and privileged humans, and then other humans, and then but even there you can sort of adapt from dominion to a compassionate stewardship, or you can extend a universal compassion beyond the human. And to be honest, naturalistic and non-religious worldviews have got plenty of work to do on that space too. Secular humanism doesn't stop you from extending compassion to non-human animals, but most humanists don't do it seriously yet. I mean, I think it'll shift and it'll change. But so all of those worldviews still have this sort of anthropocentric core, but there is some hope that they can broaden out to think about sentience.
What they need is science.
Yes, that will help. That should help. Yeah.
Darwin, I'm sorry, they hate it. Mostly the religion has fought the Darwinian theory, the principles that scientific understanding of our membership. And I like the word, our membership, our kinship with other life. Instead of seeing it as the other with a capital O, they're part of us. We're animals. We came from animals. We are animals.
I have a habit of looking for the word human and just replacing it with sentient. And it can work in so many contexts. You can think about human rights to sentient rights. You can think about democracy going to sentiocracy and the radical idea of including non-human sentient interests in our political systems. And one obvious example is humanity becomes sentientity, right? Thinking of ourselves as a community of all of the sentient. And that should be a deeply humbling step to take, because there's only 8 billion of us and there might be quadrillions of them. So
sentience is awareness, isn't it? Consciousness.
Yeah.
And we see it in animals. We see how they interact with us. They are aware of things. We see them express emotions. And if we were scientific about it in our philosophy and our ethics, we would recognize that, yes, they suffer just like we do.
And I think that ties the two big themes of these conversations together, because that naturalistic scientific understanding demonstrates to us that these beings, at least to higher credence, have sentience. And that links to the moral imperative to care about others. And by definition, others are sentient beings. And there's no good reason I've found to exclude any sentient being from our moral consideration. And it just seems to hang together quite nicely for me, again, in the way that a 6-year-old seems to be able to understand better than most adults. But
so why can't we get that across to the environmentalists that are concerned about climate change?
It's deeply frustrating.
We're wrestling with the nature question.
But this maybe my final question is about, if we've got this idea about, sort of the type of worldview you'd like to see humanity have as part of sentientity, which levers can we pull? And there are so many. There's politics, there's, as an attorney yourself, there's the world of law, there's education, there's public media, there's so many different. How do you think about which levers are the most productive to try and actually shift humanity into taking that much more constructive, positive role as part of sentientity?
Well, it's a big question.
Yeah.
That's a big question. Yeah. Every activist, animal rights activist, must choose something, that they can do to be effective. With me, it's research and writing. With activists, like some are making films and videos. I find some of the more persuasive and effective things are the images, especially moving images, videos of animals showing animal behavior that we can recognize, animal feelings, animal emotions. And now we know through science, they have the same neurotransmitters that we do. We know that animals feel joy because there's a chemical in the brain that causes us to feel joy. And for those of you who've taken drugs like ecstasy and Molly and these kind of things, what is that doing? That's stimulating oxytocin. Animals have that. In fact, in the factory farms, when they want the sows, the pigs, to breed, they inject them with oxytocin that makes them feel like mating. We know this in animals. This is science.
Yeah, it's not just, and you can do lots of science, or you can just look into the eyes of a puppy.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. But you know the mechanism that causes the joy in the brain of that animal. Because we used to argue, the philosophers used to argue, that the rationalists, how can we know that that animal is feeling fear or pain? Because we had that argument, we can't know anything. Well, yes, now we can, because we know the chemistry of the brain. Unfortunately, it comes from lots of experimentation on animals. So we have a lot of victims to find these neurotransmitters that we know cause these feelings. But now we know it. So we have to recognize that there's this continuity. We have the same brains, we have the same systems, same organs, and we have to recognize that kinship. It's a biological kinship. I call it continuity because I want to break up this idea that we're separate, we're exceptional, we're entitled, and they're not us. They're an other with a capital O. That's what we're trying to break up here. And if we can get that across, the environmentalists who just don't want to deal with the animal question at all, I'm trying to persuade them that the animal question is the nature question. You're not going to deal with overhauling our relations with the natural world unless you're going to recognize that animals are central Animals are basic to our views of nature. And if we can't deal with animals, we can't even get started.
Yeah, completely. And the evidence and the morality are pointing in the same direction. And
exactly,
there are, in many cases, not even difficult trade-offs to make, right? There are glaring win-win-win staring us in the face, right? In terms of animal ethics, protection for humans, and our shared environment. There are certain things that are blindingly obvious that we can do that are already at scale today that everybody can, help us move towards at their next meal choice. Yeah, I mean, there's hope there, but again, despair too. So
lawyers for animal rights are pulling levers. There's a lawsuit right now to prevent the corporate taking control of the property of these monkeys that escaped. So we have legal challenges.
I mean, that's my sense, right? Pull all the levers all at once as hard as we can. I think that's probably the recommendation.
Always pressing this idea that morality belongs in a wider sphere, because now we see the membership, the kinship. We are not separate from other beings. We have things in common. And our ethics have protected our feelings, like we have ethics against child abandonment, because we know the suffering that causes. Well, it's the same suffering that's caused, I don't have to tell you.
It's not rocket science. Well, I will let you go. I mean, it's been an absolutely inspirational conversation. Thank you, to add to your many decades of inspirational work. Is there anything else you wanted to add in? I mean, we've answered what's real, what matters, who matters, and how to make a better world in 90 minutes. So I think we've covered the bases pretty well.
Yeah, we have. And I thank you so much for the opportunity to talk about this stuff. We just have to keep reminding animal activists. They just don't know they've got a powder keg. They have a tiger by the tail. If they would just recognize how important animals have been in getting to where we are today. We have to. That's huge. That's what I'm trying to get across.
It's a powerful message. Thank you. So what's the best way I'll include your website and social media and, in the show notes as well. But where would you point people to follow your work, and obviously buy your new book, Madness, when it comes out as well, but also An Unnatural Order?
Well, this is the website, jimmason.website, and that's maintained by a friend of mine, Laura Moretti. And then, of course, I'm on Twitter, which is reluctantly.
Yeah.
I think it's in a death throes, but I'm hanging in there to see if it will morph into something, or if there's an alternative to Twitter. But it's Jim Mason AUO is my Twitter handle. Jim Mason AUO, the letters for An Unnatural Order. That'll find me on Twitter.
That's great. I will include those links in the show notes. And if you pop up on Blue Sky or Mastodon or any of the others, I'll add the links later. We'll see how Twitter goes.
I'm trying to find a good alternative. I'm investigating. I'd like to know more. And then, of course, my email is jbmason40. JB, lowercase JB as in Bob, Mason40 at Verizon.net. So we can communicate. And then, of course, you can always reach me through the publishers of the books. Yeah.
That's brilliant. Well, like I say, it's been an absolute inspiration. Thank you for spending so much time with me today, Jim. And thank you for being a guest on Sentientism.
Thank you, Jamie. I appreciate it very much.
Please stay in touch. Take care.
So long.